So welcome all of you. And we're gonna kick things off with the first session, and we're going to talk about radio and audio, and that's very fitting because we're here in the Marconi studio. The people who work at VRT obviously know this, but maybe this is something new. The name is derived from an Italian broadcasting engineer, perhaps a pioneer of radio, Guglielmo Marconi. I hope that was okay in Italian. So he's responsible for introducing radio here in Belgium. And to guide us through this first session, we need a real radio pro, someone that knows the ins and the outs of a radio. Some say he sleeps with his radio on when he sleeps at night, and others say he eats FM frequencies for breakfast. All I know, he's called Floris Dalemans. He works for Radio 1 here at VRT, and he'll be your guide in this first session. So please welcome Floris Dalemans.
Thank you, Niels. Thank you. The fun thing is he's also a Radio 1 presenter, so he might as well have been talking about himself this morning. I do eat FM frequencies for breakfast, and I do work at Radio 1. I host a show on Belgian music every week, every Saturday from 1 to 3. And that's not what we're going to be talking about today, although with Belpop, which is the name of the show, we also think about how we can create value with that show in an on-demand context, not just the live show we do on the radio, but also how we can work with that in new digital media, which is something we try and research at VRT Innovation. So in this 45 minutes, more or less, we'll be seeing two presentations, and after that there will be sort of a panel discussion about the topic at hand, which is how do you position yourself as an audio brand? For VRT, that is already a good question because we are historically a television and radio broadcasting institution. Radio has always been our first focus, but we are also shifting towards an audio production house that also does radio, but we also produce a lot of podcasts. We have Select, which is our on-demand offering in the radio apps and all that kind of stuff. So we have to position ourselves as an audio brand as well. To guide us through this topic, I have two guests, Catherine Lakom, first off, who is a colleague at VRT. She's now editor-in-chief for audio at VRT Max, which is our one-stop shop for digital content online. It used to be called VRT Nu, it's now called VRT Max, and she will be explaining how that happened and why we did that. She also has a radio history at Radio 2 and M&M, but is now, as I said, editor-in-chief for the audio team at VRT Max. And the second presentation and second panelist will be Wouter Van Driessche, who used to be a journalist at Humo, which is a weekly magazine here in Belgium for our international guests. He also worked at the Tijd newspaper and lastly at the Standaard newspaper, where he was one of the driving forces in their podcast offering that they have been rolling out over the last couple of years. They will start off with a short presentation about who they are and what they bring, and then we'll be going into the panel discussion. So Catherine, I will give the floor to you first off for your presentation.
Thank you. Okay. Good morning, everyone. As they said, we're working for VRT Max. This is our platform from the VRT. We have audio in VRT Max now, and that's a new thing for us. Because first, I'm going to present myself. I'm Catherine. I live here. I work in the audio team of VRT. We are 4 people, and our team was born 1 year ago. There was no audio team at VRT. All of our radio and TV brands made podcasts, but they all did that by themselves, by best means. But now we have an audio team that, coordinates everything that means digital audio and podcast for the whole of VRT. It was a year of change because we've been working for 1 year now, and we say radically digital. That's what we are saying to all of our radio and TV brands. And you see the A-team bus there. We are driving around this bus around the VRT. So In the beginning, we said we are the A team. We're a new team. 4 people that worked in radio are now working together to coordinate everything around digital audio. But we're not going to sit in a little corner and wait till things happen. We want to make this digital change in the whole of the organization. So we thought, how are we going to do that? And after we thought, we watched everything that had to be done. There's a lot of work for us. We were thinking about how to spread the message throughout the whole of the organization, and the A team was a good metaphor for us. So we used this little bus to drive around, and we made a presentation to say, this is us, this is what we do, this is what we stand for, and this is how we can help you change through the whole process to make digital audio and not just a radio program that is a podcast and that is put online somewhere. And we had a lot of meetings with, I think, about everyone in the organization, just to present ourselves and to say what we are doing. And this was very important because we are a team of 4 people, but we are not makers. We don't make podcasts. And we're just 4 people. It's not possible for 4 people to make a whole transition in an organization. It's the organization itself that has to do the transition. So it was very important for us to have the minds waking and so for everyone to be with us and to spread our message through the organization. What we do is to coordinate the whole of the podcast content, but also every process that is going before a podcast, after a podcast, everything that is needing to make digital audio, because it's not only podcasts. I say we have audio now in VRT Max. This was not always the case, so I will now tell you, before we had VRT Max, we had an app called VRT Nu, which is VRT Now if you translate it. This was a video app, and then we changed into a video and audio app. This was the old branding, and this is the new branding. This is what VRT Nu looked like after a little while. So when we started, it was just a video app. And then we thought audio also had to be in the app. So in May, we put podcasts in the app. We did it gradually, just slowly. We didn't campaign around it. We learned a lot ourselves. It was a very interesting period. And then in the summer, we also said podcast is one thing, but we also need live radio, because that's a big, that's needed for the audience, because a lot of people want to listen to live radio. And we started redirecting from the radio websites to VRT Max, VRT Nu. It was called VRT Nu back then. So that was 2 changes we made. We changed, you see, voor jou is for you, kijk is watch, and luister is listen. Before there was just a listening app, and we changed the whole listening thing. So you can find radio and audio there. It's not podcast. That's important for us as well, that it's not just podcast, but it's listening. We didn't campaign at that point very, very widely, because we knew there was a rebranding coming up. We were going from VRT Nu to VRT Max. But we wanted people to know that there was audio in this app. So how we did that was by telling the audience, hey, this is the place you can also listen to. So we told our radio DJs, if you are telling something about a podcast, don't say listen to it on your favorite podcast platform, which we usually say, because that's like saying, hey, listen to it on Spotify. So we asked them to say listen on VRT Nu. In all our campaigning, we also said VRT Nu, and that was the first step. No big campaign, but just letting people know this is the place where you can find our content. Because before, people could find our podcasts in the radio websites, on the radio apps, because all of our radio brands have a specific radio app that they use mostly for interaction with their audience during live radio. But it was also the place where you could find the podcasts. But you would have to look through the app of Radio 1, Radio 2, M&M, Studio Brussels. So the podcasts were everywhere. You could only find the podcast that your radio brand made for you, but you couldn't see the other podcasts. So the big change is now that if you go to VRT Nu at that point, or VRT Max now, that you can find the whole of the content. And that's the big change. So we want people to discover everything we have. And we also made a small poster campaign just here at VRT. Maybe some people saw this in the toilets. We wanted our colleagues also to know that the audio was in VRT Nu, because if everyone in the organization knows this, they can also carry it out, and it's also important for everyone to engage this idea. Another thing we did was put our logo on the external platforms, on our tiles of the podcasts. As you can see, the Laatste Queen is about Queen Elizabeth, of course, and Napoleon here, the other one, has also the VRT Max logo. Before, all of our podcasts had the branding of their own radio. So Napoleon is made by Clara, our classical station. It had Clara on it. We removed all of the logos from the podcast tiles, and we put VRT Max on it to put this on external platforms. At this point, it was VRT Nu, but it's sometimes changing. You can see here below, this one was made by Clara, the Bourgondiërs. At first, it said the Bourgondiërs with Bart van Loo, the man who made it. During the years, because this is a podcast we have for a number of years, it's our best listened podcast, it changed. The logo changed because it was just down under, then it was in the back, and in the end, this is the one we have now, has no logo. On external platforms, it gets the VRT Max logo. Our podcasts that are made by VRT News, our news brand, have their own VRT News branding because they want to sign off as this is news made by VRT. You can trust this news, so it's a very important stamp for the audience. And then it was there, it was born on the 29th of August this year, so it's a young baby, our VRT Max. It's the app where you can watch and listen. We kept the voor jou, de kijk en de luister. Dus for you, it's the first page where you get content that is for you. You can watch and you can listen. We also know that people, before they use the app, they choose to watch or listen. So we have a video and audio app. So we came from a video app, and now we have both in one app. Why didn't we build an audio app next to the video app? Because we didn't have to start from scratch. There already was an app with an audience that we could use. Otherwise, we would have had to start with a new app, and we would have say, hey, we have an app. Would you please come listen to us? We would have had a lot of more, it would have taken more effort to get people there. And that's the second thing, it's cost efficient to have one app. At this point, we have a tram driving through Antwerp that is VRT Max branded. If we want to make this kind of marketing, we would have needed 2 trams, for instance. If you want to develop something in the app, we would have had to do this for 2 apps. If you want innovation in your app, it's ×2. So if you keep all of this in one app, it's more cost efficient. You have more scale and volume. You have also a large catalog of content in video and in audio. People can discover everything that is on the app, where therefore all of our audio was in the different radio apps or websites. Now they can see, oh, I might like this one. I might like this one as well. I didn't know this one existed. So it's bringing everything together gives you a large content catalog. And it is also a companion all day long, this app, because a video app mostly lives in the evening. When you come from work, when you come from school, you watch something. But now we notice that during the day, we also have podcasts there. So in the morning, people can listen to their favorite podcasts to when they go to work, when they go to school, and in the evening they can watch the same app to watch video content. Also, we asked our users before we did this, would you like also audio in your VRT Nu app? And they said, yes, we would like that. We talked to our users a lot, and that helped us also. And we talked to other broadcasters through Europe to see how they experienced having a double app or just an audio app. And with all of that knowledge, we built VRT Max, video and audio. Does that work? Maybe audio in a video and audio app? It does. This is a little timeline. Here we started putting audio in the app, and this is just before we launched VRT Max. So without a big campaign, just by gradually adding audio, we almost reached the same level as Apple Podcasts. And this is before the big relaunch of VRT Max. So yes, it works. And so I want to thank you with one of our podcast titles, but not with offending anyone. But I don't think there's boomers in the hall. So thank you.
Okay, merci Catherine. And then you can come sit on the couch if you want. Next up is Wouter Van Driessche. I introduced him as a former journalist. I think he will always be a journalist in some shape or form, but he's now the creative director of Uitgesproken, Outspoken?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Outspoken in English, which is an audio, well, explain what it is, Wouter, please do. Welcome.
Podcasting agency. Hi, hello everybody. Just to get a sense of who's in this venue, who is in podcasting, who's making podcasts, who's creating audio. Okay. And who is listening to podcasts? Okay. So the story of Catherine was about platforms and let's say the front office where you can get your podcast to listen to. Mine will be more a story of the back office. So as Floris said, I'm the creative director of Uitgesproken. Before I was a journalist, I'm no longer Floris. I sent back my press card before I started Uitgesproken as we are working for a variety of brands, which are not news brands. So deontologically, is that a word in English, deontologically? Yeah, that wasn't possible. So I said that I was going to focus on the back story, and I thought to present you today 8 things that I wish I would have known 500 podcast episodes ago. The 500 is a real number. I started, I went into podcast some 5 years ago. I didn't have any background in audio whatsoever. I was a journalist, an old school journalist who was writing mainly for the newspaper. Your name had to be in print at the time to really count as a journalist. The digital revolution started out while I was writing. So I switched to audio, and then I got to be in Uitgesproken. And just to give you a sense, these are some of the podcasts that we've been making over the past, I think it's 2 years now. Yeah. Last year we created 100 podcast episodes, worth 3,000 minutes of audio. So every week we produce more or less 1 hour of podcast. And as of late, we've been working for VRT Max as well. I've been working with Catherine on the podcast on the top left corner. So very happy to, but we make a variety of podcasts. For VRT, we're making podcasts for Woestijnvis, which is a production company in Belgium, with Woestijnvis, I should say, in co-production. We make podcasts for a bank, we make podcasts for cultural institutions, for insurers. We have been consulting other news brands to make their series of podcasts. So it's quite a vast domain that we cover at Uitgesproken. Actually, the idea is that whatever your idea is, if it's a podcast-worthy idea, because not every idea is going to work in audio, but if we think that it could make a great podcast, then we're open for any collaboration. In fact, then let's see. I started out 5 years ago This was the place that we started out. It was at the newsroom of the Standaard, the old newsroom. They moved afterwards, and there was this little, this little space. I think it was a telephone booth, more or less. It was like 4 or 5 square meters. We didn't have any microphones. We didn't have any acoustics. We just put up a number of curtains and a laptop, and then someone who knew what he was doing. And that's how we created the podcast. And that's my first learning, actually, that podcast isn't rocket science. And the best proof is that I'm in it for 5 years and I didn't have any background whatsoever in audio. So it isn't rocket science. I think anyone can start a podcast. But, and there's a big but, if you want to do it right, it's a little more complicated than you would think. It's not because it's not rocket science that it's easy. And just one striking example to make it very concrete, how complicated this is. This has been our biggest headache for the first year. It was a fluorescent light that was on top of the table that we recorded our first podcasts with, and it buzzed into the microphones. So every time, the first couple of episodes, we recorded in the dark because we had to climb on the table, undo the fluorescent light, and then we could start recording. So it's not all that complicated. A small space can be a starting point, can be your first studio. But if you want to be technically, or if you want to make a podcast that's technically okay, there are some things. Audio is quite complicated, actually. And I've been working, actually, when we did a podcast with Wouter Van Driessche, they are a television production company. We noticed that they made a pre-cut, and that a lot of the cuts, a lot of the edits that they made didn't work in audio, whereas on television they would have worked perfectly fine. And the reason is that you don't have any, you don't have a visual aid, you don't have anything to distract the viewer when you're making a cut. So audio is quite unforgiving, and it's quite harsh, actually, as a medium to start editing with. So it's a bit more complicated than you think. That was the first lesson. 7 more to go. So don't underthink your podcast. You shouldn't overthink it, but you shouldn't underthink it either. And I think the main question everyone should ask themselves before getting into podcasting is why you are making a podcast and who you are making it for. And it's a thing that's very, very often, I mean, it's so obvious. I thought about leaving this slide out because for storytellers, it's like, obviously the first question, why are we making this and who are we making this for? And yet, if you would look at the top 10 podcasts in on any podcast platform, or if you would look at the podcast failures, I think that very often the answer why something is very successful or why something failed is in that very question. So it's something that's quite often, I think, still overlooked. When we started making podcasts at the Standaard, this was a very important question. Why? Because there is Radio 1 at VRT, and Radio 1 is a news radio. So you're at the newspaper, you want to make a podcast about the news, and then there's news radio. That very fact, that very setup is something that's quite compelling, and that you should think deeply about before starting anything, because you could very well end up in a situation where you would try to compete with a news radio with a daily programming and with their mission to bring the news as quickly to you as they can. I mean, it's no use trying to compete that with to 20 years old in a small venue at a newspaper. You're never going to win that. So you need to do something else. And that's where the why comes in. And that's when the who for comes in, and why they are such important questions. Third learning is that it's important that you have your why and your who for inform every decision you make. This is the campaign at the time that we did at the Standaard when we launched our podcast. And for those of you who are coming from Flanders or who know the Standaard, this is not typically what you would see in an advertisement for the Standaard. It's much younger, it's much more colorful, it has a different tone of voice, it has a different imagery, and all that was done obviously on purpose because we wanted with the podcast to aim for a younger audience, an audience that would not necessarily have the newspaper at breakfast, maybe didn't even have our podcast app, but that maybe we could try to reach through podcasting, which is why we chose for this advertisement, but which is also why we chose not to have a mature presenter for the podcast, but just a 20-year-old asking questions about the news that 20-year-olds would ask themselves. That was at least the setup at the time. Then later on, it evolved, but that was the setup, and that was very deliberate. Another example, this is a podcast that we make for an outdoors brand. So this is a branded podcast. But as they are an outdoor brand, obviously we weren't going to record a podcast in a studio. And obviously we were going to undertake things. And from the photograph up to the music, the sound design, the people that we're talking from, the host, how the podcast is conceived, there's always this why and this who for that's in the back of our heads, and I think it's a really important one when you start making podcasts. This was, by the way, I don't know if you can hear it all right.
What a picture, please. Yes. Yes.
These were the first seconds of the very first episode. And this also was a conscious choice. We wanted to start out with something that felt as this feels, that felt warm, that felt as if we were doing something. We were doing something as if we had dived into a swimming pool, which we did. And all of that, actually, we declined it from these very first questions. Fourth learning is be consistent, be persistent, and be patient. Actually, at the Standaard again, we started out making podcasts for, I think, the first episode, it was like 150 listeners. And then after a couple of weeks, we had it for 1,000 listeners. But for a newspaper, the scale of the Standaard, that's really not an audience that you should be aiming for. I mean, why do the effort? Because your newspaper is so big. Why try making things for 1,000 people? But yet what we noticed is, and that's a big podcast cliche, but it turned out to be true, that from these 1,000 people that were listening, that 999 sent us emails to say how much they appreciated the podcast. So we felt that we had an impact that we couldn't measure through the simple reach, but that we had an impact that was quite different. And when I stopped the podcast, when I stopped at the newspaper 2 years ago, I think we were having more than 100,000 listens and downloads a week. And meanwhile, I think the last figure that I know of was like 170,000 downloads and listens a week. But it took time. And I think, Catherine, that's something that you notice as well. In the first couple of weeks, I say that almost on a weekly basis to our partners, don't look at the numbers until you're like 2, 3, 4 months far, because it takes time, and there's a very, very rewarding long tail in podcasting. Another example, this is a podcast we did for Woestijnvis, Bastian Petro, which was our first real podcast hit at Outspoken. It was 6 episodes, and when the 6th episode was published, we were at, I think, more or less 75,000 downloads and listens. And we said to each other, oh, wouldn't it be great if we had the 100,000 mark at the end? And I think meanwhile, we're somewhere at, I think, more or less 300,000. So all of those listens, actually the vast majority of listens came well after the podcast was published in its entirety. So the long tail is something to be very mindful about. Storytelling tip, make it personal, make it concrete, make it relatable. Very important in podcasting as well. This is a podcast we did for the city of Antwerp, in which people living who are living in Antwerp actually gave a testimonial about how they lived racism, exclusion, intimidation, and it were their stories. We didn't have an expert explain what racism was. We actually went for the lived true testimonial, and I think that's what podcast was invented for, actually. Then another tip, there's layers and layers and layers and layers and layers in podcasting. In television, I wouldn't say that television or video is simple, but it's quite straightforward. You have image, you have sound, and then in sound you have some layers, and maybe you can do some things with text. In podcast, you have endless possibilities of adding layers on top of each other. It's what makes some of the great music that's out there, but it's also what makes some of the greatest podcasts. This is just a screenshot for the last podcast we did for VRT Max, and this was the less complicated part of the edit. So as you can see, there's an enormous amount of layers to play with, and actually that's a tip I would give you if you start going into podcasting, is to use every trick in the book when it comes to podcasting. Just a small example from the podcast I mentioned earlier. There's someone actually telling a story about how people kept touching her hair and how that felt as an invasion in her personal privacy. And instead of her having her narrate one particular incident, we asked her to read aloud an Instagram post that she wrote about it. And then in audio, the beauty is that you don't have to just listen to the Instagram post in its entirety, but that you can play with layers. And this is what we
Stop touching my hair. 22 augustus, festival. Iemand dronken dat ik niet ken, grijpt in mijn haar. 27 augustus. Opnieuw. 31 iemand dronken dat mijn haar vastpakt. 3 september. Te vragen. Café. 11 september. Festival. 18 september.
And this is so simple. It's a basic trick in audio editing, but it makes for a listen that's way more compelling than if you would just have someone read an Instagram post. And it's what makes podcasts, I think, so powerful as a medium is that you can, really. There's so much editing tools at your disposition, and that's the seventh thing I would have wanted to know a long time ago. It's that it's all in the editing, the amount of days in post-production. If you want to make a podcast that's worthwhile, it sounds really simple if it's well done, but the simpler it sounds, generally the harder or the more effort that was put in it. Just a small example. In this episode, we had a talk about freediving, and then we had Anke, the person on the left, tell how that experience was of freediving. And I'll just let you hear 30 seconds of how that sounded in the final edit.
Focus, omdat je zit heel sterk gefocust op je lichaam eigenlijk, op alles wat je gewaar wordt. En maar dat je daar, als je die diepte ingaat, je voelt ook echt wel die druk stijgen. Maar je hebt 0 afleiding. Geen geluid. Het is daar stil. En zeker bij die 36 meter, op een gegeven moment dacht ik van, oh wauw. Ik hoor mijn hartslag. Of ik voel mijn hartslag. Of allebei. Dat was heel prominent aanwezig, heel...
This is just a small soundbite, but this went back and forth, I think, 7 or 8 times between ourselves and then the editor in audio to make it work. And over here in a venue through speakers, it doesn't have the effect that it would have if you'd have it in your ears. But that, I think, is the difference between real audio storytelling and, as Catherine said earlier, radio that you then a radio show that you then put out as a podcast, which has its own right to exist. But I think digital audio storytelling is a different thing. And then the last learning is that when you are done with your podcast and when you've put in all the effort and when you've made all the decisions that you have to make to end up with a good, possibly a great MP3, that's just the start. A podcast is not just a podcast, it's also a title, a logo, a photo, an Insta, and a campaign. This is the podcast we did. We launched yesterday for the KMSKA. And as you see, there's a videographer present, there was a photographer, and putting out that podcast means that people are going to decide themselves whether they're going to listen or not. So you'd have to lure them in through all the ways possible, and that starts with a logo and with really a campaign. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to...
Moest ik een naaktfoto sturen naar iemand, zo'n kunstwerk laten maken. En dan laten leveren. Snap je? Hey, ik ben Floinde en ik sta aan het Koninklijk Museum voor Schone Kunsten in Antwerpen. En ik ga op zoek naar het kunstwerk met de meeste passie.
Holy shit zelfs.
Heftig.
So there's Insta videos, and in the Insta videos you'd have the same typography as on the logos, and some of the photos would be shown there. So there's a lot of effort put in that campaign. It's not only for this podcast. This is another example. We made a podcast called Keihard with two opinion makers in Flanders, Dalila Hermans, Josephine Dalemans. And there as well, we thought really well about, because this was an independent podcast, how we were going to market and distribute that. And I think that's something in audio, but in the photo as well, we worked on them being all smiles. And then if you would look at their Instagram page, I'm not going to run the audio, you'd see this pattern, and all of the Instagram tiles were actually also small. We're also fixed things in the podcast that would then become an Instagram post, and all of that helps to build an audience, to build some reach for this podcast, and all of that were conscious choices. I think I ran out of time, so I'm going to leave it right here. If you have any questions, my phone number is there. Please do reach out. Thank you very much.